Chapter 16 of Gulliver of Mars. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Christopher. Gulliver of Mars by Edwin L. Arnold. Chapter 16. The Martian told me of a merchant boat with 10 rowers which was going up to the capital in a couple of hours. And as the skipper was a friend of his, they would no doubt take me as supercargo, thereby saving me the necessity of passenger fees, which was obviously a consideration with me. It was not altogether a romantic approach to the dungeon of an imprisoned beauty, but it was practical, which is often better if not so pleasant. So the offer was gladly closed with, and curling myself in a rug of fox-skins, for I was tired with much walking, sailors never being good foot-gainers, I slept soundly till they came to tell me it was time to go on board. The vessel was more like a canal barge than anything else, lean and long, with the cargo piled in a ridge down the center as farmers store their winter turnips. The rowers sitting on either side of this plying oars like dessert spoons with long handles, while they chanted a monotonous cadence of monosyllables. Oh ho oh, oh ho oh, how high, how high. And then again, after a pause, how high, oh ho ho, oh ho ho. The which was infinitely sleep-provoking, if not a refrain of high intellectual order. I shut my eyes as we pulled away from the wharfs of that nameless emporium, and picked a passage through a crowd of quaint shipping, wondering where I was, and asking myself whether I was mentally rising equally to my extraordinary surroundings, whether I adequately appreciated the immensity of my remove from those other seas on which I had last travelled, tiller ropes in hand, piloting a captain's galley from a wharf. Good heavens! What would my comrades on my ship say if they could see me now steering a load of hairy savages up one of those waterways which our biggest telescopes magnify to but the thickness of an indication? No, I was not rising equal to the occasion, and could not. The human mind is of but limited capacity after all, and such freaks of fortune are beyond its conception. I knew where I was, but I knew I should probably never get the chance of telling it, and that no one would ever believe me if I did, and I resigned myself to the inevitable with sullen acquiescence, smothering the wonder that might have been overwhelming and passing interest of the moment. There is little to record of that voyage. We passed through a fleet of Ar hap's warships, empty and at anchor in double lines, serviceable half-decked cutters, built of solid timber, not pumpkin-rind it was pleasant to notice, and then the town dropped away as we proceeded up a stream about as broad as the Hudson at its widest, and profusely studded with islands. The water was bitterly salt, and joined another sea on the other side of the Martian continent. Yet it had a pronounced flow against us eastward, this tide running for 3 spring months and being followed, I learned, as ocean temperatures varied, by a flow in the opposite direction throughout the summer. Just at present the current was so strong eastwards the moisture beaded upon my rowers' tawny hides as they struggled against it, and their melancholy song dawdled in linked sweetness long drawn out, while the swing of their oars grew longer and longer. Truly it was very hot, far hotter than was usual for the season, these men declared, and possibly this robbed me of my wonted energy, and you, gentle reader, of a description of all the strange things we passed upon that highway. Suffice it to say, we spent a scorching afternoon, the greater part of a stifling night, moored under a mud bank, with a grove of trees on top from which gigantic fireflies hung as though the place were illuminated for a garden fete, and then, rowing on again in the comparatively cool hours before dawn, turned into a backwater at cockcrow. The skipper of our cargo boat roused me just as we turned, putting under my sleepy nostrils a handful of toasted beans on a leaf, and a small cupful of something that was not coffee, but smelt as good as that matutinal beverage always does to the tired traveller. Over our prow was an immense arch of foliage, and underneath a long arcade of cool black shadows, sheltering still water, till water and shadow suddenly ended a quarter of a mile down in a patch of brilliant colour. It was as peaceful as could be in the first morning light, and to me over all there was the inexpressible attraction of the unknown. As our boat slipped silently forward up this leafy lane, a thin white feather in her mouth alone breaking the steely surface of the stream, the men rested from their work and began, as sailors will, to put on their shore-going clothes, the while they chatted in low tones over the profits of the voyage. Overhead flying squirrels were flitting to and fro like bats, or shelling fruit whereof the husk fell with a pleasant splash about us, and on one bank a couple of early mothers were washing their babies, whose smothered protests were almost the only sound in this morning world. Another silent dip or two of the oars, and the colour ahead crystallized into a town. If I said it was like an African village on a large scale, I should probably give you the best description in the fewest words. From the very water's edge up to the crown of a low hill inland, extended a mass of huts and wooden buildings, embowered and partially hidden in the bright green foliage, with here and there patches of millet, or some such food plant, and the flowers that grow everywhere so abundantly in this country. It was all Arcadian and peaceful enough at the moment, and as we drew near the men were just coming out to the quays along the harbour front, the streets filling, and the town waking to busy life. A turn to the left through a water gate defended by towers of wood and mud, and we were in the city harbour itself. Boats of many kinds moored on every side, quaint craft from the gulfs and bays of nowhere, full of unheard-of merchandise, and manned by strange-faced crews, every vessel a romance of nameless seas, an epitome of an undiscovered world, and every moment the scene grew busier as the breakfast smoke rose, and wharf and gangway set to work upon the day's labours. Our boat, loaded as it turned out with spoil from Seth, was run to a place of honour at the bottom of the town square, and was an object of much curiosity to a small crowd which speedily collected and lent a hand with the mooring ropes, the while chatting excitedly with the crew about further tribute and the latest news from overseas. At the same time a swarthy barbarian, whose trappings showed him to be some sort of functionary, came down to our captain, much wagging of heads and counting of notched sticks taking place between them. I, indeed, was apparently the least interesting item of the cargo, and this was embarrassing. No hero likes to be neglected, it is fatal to his part. I had said my prayers and steeled myself to all sorts of fine endurance on the way up, and here, when it came to the crisis, no one was anxious to play the necessary villain. They just helped me ashore civilly enough. The captain nodded his head at me, muttering something in an indifferent tone to the functionary about a ghost who had wandered overseas and begged a passage up the canal. The group about the quay started a little, but that was all. Once I remembered seeing a squatting, life-size heathen idol hoisted from a vessel's hold and deposited on a sugar box on a New York quay. Some ribald passer-by put a battered felt hat upon Vishnu's sacred curls, and there the poor image sat, an alien in an indifferent land, a sack across its shoulders, a billycock upon its head, and honoured at most with a passing stare. I thought of that lonely image, as almost as lonely I stood on the thitherman's quay, without the support of friends or heroics, wondering what to do next. However, a cheerful disposition is sometimes better than a banking account, and not having the one, I cultivated the other, sunning myself amongst the bales for a time, and then, since none seemed interested in me, wandered off into the town, partly to satisfy my curiosity, and partly in the vague hope of ascertaining if my princess was really here, and if possible, getting sight of her. Meanwhile it turned hot with a supernatural heavy sort of heat, altogether, I heard passers-by exclaiming, out of the common, and after wandering for an hour through gardens and endless streets of thatched huts, I was glad enough to throw myself down in the shadows of some trees on the outskirts of the great central pile of buildings. A whole village in itself, of beam-built towers and dwelling-place, suggesting by its superior size that it might actually be Arhap's palace. Hotter and hotter it grew, while a curious secondary sunrise in the west, the like of which I never saw before, seemed to add to the heat, and heavier my eyelids, till I dozed at last, and finally slept uncomfortably for a time. Rousing up suddenly, imagine my surprise to see sitting, chin on hands, about a yard away, a slender girlish figure, infinitely out of place in that world of rough barbarians. Was it possible? Was I dreaming? No, there was no doubt about it. She was a girl of the hither folk, slim and pretty, but with a wonderfully sad look in her gazelle eyes, and scarcely a sign of the indolent happiness of Seth in the pale little face regarding me so fixedly. "Good gracious, miss," I said, still rubbing my eyes and doubting my senses, "have you dropped from the skies? You are the very last person I expected to see in this barbarian place." "And you too, sir. Oh, it is lovely to see one so newly from home, and free-seeming, not a slave." "How did you know I was from Seth?" "Oh, that was easy enough," and with a little laugh she pointed to a pebble lying between us, on which was a piece of battered sweetmeat in a perforated bamboo box. Poor An had given me something just like that in a playful mood, and I had kept it in my pocket for her sake, being, as you will have doubtless observed, a sentimental young man. And now I clapped my hand where it should have been, but it was gone. "Yes," said my new friend, "that is yours. I smelt the sweetmeat coming up the hill, and crossed the grass until I found you here asleep. Oh, it was lovely! I took it from your pocket, and white Seth rose up before my swimming eyes, even at the scent of it. I am Sigh, well named, for that in our land means sadness. Sigh, the daughter of Prince Hath's chief sweetmeat maker, so I should know something of such stuff. May I please nibble a little piece?" "Eat it all, my lass, and welcome. How came you here? But I can guess. Do not answer if you would rather not." "Ay, but I will. It is not every day I can speak to ears so friendly as yours. I am a slave, chosen for my luckless beauty as last year's tribute to Arhap." "And now?" "And now the slave of Arhap's horsekeeper, set aside to make room for a fresher face." "And do you know whose face that is?" "Not I, a hapless maid sent into this land of horrors, to bear ignominy and stripes, to eat coarse food and do coarse work, the miserable plaything of some brute in semi-human form, with but the one consolation of dying early as we tribute women always die. Poor comrade in exile, I only know her as yet by sympathy." "What if I said it was Heru, the princess?" The Martian girl sprang to her feet, and clasping her hands exclaimed, "Heru the slender! Then the end comes, for it is written in our books that the last tribute is paid when the best is paid. Oh, how splendid if she gave herself of free will to this slavery to end it once and for all! Was it so?" "I think, Sigh, your princess could not have known of that tradition. She did not come willingly. Besides, I am come to fetch her back, if it may be, and that spoils the look of sacrifice." "You fetch her back from Arhap's arms? My word, Sir Spirit, you must know some potent charms. Or, what is less likely, my countrymen must have amazingly improved in pluck since I left them. Have you a great army at hand?" But I only shook my head, and touching my sword, said that here was the only army coming to rescue Heru, whereon the lady replied that she thought my valour did me more honour than my discretion. How did I propose to take the princess from her captors? "To tell the truth, damsel, that is a matter which will have to be left to your invention, or the kindness of such as you. I am here on a hare-brained errand, playing knight errant in a way that shocks my common sense. But since the matter has gone so far, I will see it through, or die in the attempt. Your bully lord shall either give me Heru, lock, stock, and block, or hang me from a yardarm. But I would rather have the lady. Come, you will help me, and as a beginning, if she is in yonder shanty, get me speech with her." Poor Sigh's eyes dilated at the peril of the suggestion, and I saw the sluggish Martian nature at war against her better feelings. But presently the latter conquered. "I will try," she said. "What matter a few stripes more or less?" Pointing to her rosy shoulders, where red scars criss-cross upon one another showed how the Martian girls fared in Arhap's palace when their novelty wore off. "I will try to help you, and if they kill me for it, why, that will not matter much." And forthwith in that blazing forenoon under the flickering shadow of the trees we put our heads together to see what we might do for Heru. It was not much for the moment. Try what we would that afternoon, I could not persuade those who had charge of the princess to let me even approach her place of imprisonment. But Sigh as a woman was more successful, actually seeing her for a few moments, and managed to whisper in her ear that I had come, the spirit with the gold buttons down his front, afterwards describing to me in flowing Martian imagery, but doubtless not more highly coloured than poor Heru's emotion warranted, how delightedly that lady had received the news. Sigh also did me another service, presenting me to the porter's wife, who kept a kind of boarding house at the gates of Arhap's palace for gentlemen and ladies with grievances. I had heard of lobbying before, and the presentation of petitions, though I had never indulged myself in the pastime, but the crowd of petitioners here, with petitions as wild and picturesque as their own motley appearances, was surely the strangest that ever gathered round a seat of supreme authority. Sigh whispered in the ear of that good woman the nature of my errand, with doubtless some blandishment of her own, and my errand being one so much above the vulgar, and so nearly touching the sovereign, I was at once accorded a separate room in the gatehouse, whence I could look down in comparative peace on the common herd of suitors, and listen to the buzz of their invective, as they practised speeches, which I calculated it would take Ar hap all the rest of his reign to listen to, without allowing him any time for pronouncing verdicts on them. Here I made myself comfortable, and waited the return of the sovereign as placidly as might be. Meanwhile fate was playing into my feeble hands. I have said it was hot weather. At first this seemed but an outcome of the Martian climate, but as the hours went by the heat developed to an incredible extent. Also that red glare, previously noted in the west, grew in intensity, till, as the hours slipped by, all the town was staring at it in panting horror. I have seen a prairie on fire, luckily from the far side of a comfortably broad river, and have ridden through a pine forest when every tree for miles was an uplifted torch, and pungent yellow smoke rolled down each quarry side in grey rivers crested with dancing flame. But that Martian glare was more sombre and terrible than either. "What is it?" I asked of poor Si, who came out gasping to speak to me by the gatehouse. "None of us know, and unless the gods these thitherfolk believe in are angry, and intend to destroy the world with yonder red sword in the sky, I cannot guess. Perhaps," she added, with a sudden flash of inspiration, "it comes by your machinations for Heru's help." "No!" "If not by your wish, then, in the name of all you love, set your wish against it. If you know any incantations suitable for the occasion, oh, practise them now at once. For look, even the very grass is withering. Birds are dropping from trees. Fishes, horribly bloated, are beginning to float down the streaming rills. And I, with all others, have a nameless dread upon me." Hotter and hotter it grew, until about sunset the red blaze upon the sky slowly opened, and showed us for about half an hour through the opening a lurid flame-coloured meteor far out in space beyond. Then the cleft closed again, and through that abominable red curtain came the very breath of Hades. What was really happening I am not astronomer enough to say, though on cooler consideration I have come to the conclusion that our planet, in going out to its summer pastures in the remoter fields of space, had somehow come across a wandering lesser world and got pretty well singed in passing. This is purely my own opinion, and I have not yet submitted it to the kindly authorities of the Lick Observatory for verification. All I can say for certain is that in an incredibly short space of time the face of the country changed from green to sere. Flowers drooped, streams, there were not many in the neighbourhood apparently, dried up. Fishes died. A mighty thirst there was nothing to quench settled down upon man and beast, and we all felt that unless Providence listened to the prayers and imprecations which the whole town set to work with frantic zeal to hurl at it, or that abominable comet in the sky sheered off on another tack with the least possible delay, we should all be reduced to cinders in a very brief space of time. End of Chapter 16. Recording by James Christopher, jxchristopher@yahoo.com. Chapter 17 of Gulliver of Mars. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Christopher. Gulliver of Mars by Edwin L. Arnold. Chapter 17. The evening of the second day had already come when Ar hap arrived home after weekending amongst a tribe of rebellious subjects. But any imposing state entry which might have been intended was rendered impossible by the heat and the threat of that baleful world in the western sky. It was a lurid but disordered spectacle which I witnessed from my room in the gatehouse just after nightfall. The returning army had apparently fallen away exhausted on its march through the town. Only some 300 of the bodyguards struggled up the hill, limp and sweating, behind a group of pinions, in the midst of which rode a horseman whose commanding presence and splendid war harness impressed me, though I could not make out his features. A wild, impressionist scene of black outlines, tossing headgear and spears glittering and vanishing in front of the red glare in the sky, but nothing more. Even the dry throats of the suitors in the courtyard hardly mustered a husky cry of welcome as the cavalcade trooped into the enclosure, and then the shadows enfolded them up in silence. And too hot and listless to care much what the morrow brought forth, I threw myself on the bare floor, tossing and turning in a vain endeavour to sleep until dawn came once more. A thin mist which fell with daybreak drew a veil over the horrible glare in the west for an hour or two, and taking advantage of the slight alleviation of heat, I rose and went into the gardens to enjoy a dip in the pool, making with its surrounding jungle of flowers one of the pleasantest things about the Wood King's forest citadel. The very earth seemed scorched and baking underfoot, and the pool was gone. It had run as dry as a lime kiln, nothing remained of the pretty fall which had fed it but a miserable trickle of drops from the cascade above. Down beyond the town shone a gleam of water where the bitter canal steamed and simmered in the first grey of the morning, but up here 6 months of scorching drought could not have worked more havoc. The very leaves were drooping from the trees, and the luxuriant growths of the day before looked as though a simoon had played upon them. I staggered back in disgust, and found some show of official activity about the palace. It was the king's custom, it appeared, to hear petitions and redress wrongs as soon after his return as possible. But today the ceremony was to be cut short, as his majesty was going out with all his court to a neighbouring mountain to pray away the comet, which by this time was causing dire alarm all through the city. Heaven's own particular blessings on his prayers, my friend, I said to the man who told me this. Unless his majesty's orisons are fruitful, we shall all be cooked like baked potatoes before nightfall. And though I have faced many kinds of death, that is not the one I would choose by preference. Is there any chance of my being heard at the throne? Your peculiar climate tempts me to hurry up with my business and be gone, if I may. Not only may you be heard, sir, but you are summoned. The king has heard of you somehow, and sent me to find and bring you into his presence at once. So be it, I said, too hot to care what happened. I have no levee dress with me. I lost my luggage check some time ago, but if you will wait outside, I will be with you in a moment. Hastily tidying myself up, and giving my hair a comb, as though just off to see Mr. Secretary for the Navy, or on the way to get a senator to push the new patent medicine for me, I rejoined my guide outside, and together we crossed the wide courtyard, entered the great log-built portals of Ar hap's house, and immediately afterwards found ourselves in a vast hall dimly lit by rays coming in through the square spaces under the eaves, and crowded on both sides with guards, courtiers, and supplicants. The heat was tremendous, the odour of thithermen and the ill-dressed hides which they wore almost overpowering. Yet little I recked for either, for there at the top of the room, seated on a dais made of rough-hewn wood, inlet with gold and covered with splendid furs, was Ar hap himself. A fine fellow, swarthy, huge, and hairy. At any other time or place, I would have given him due admiration as an admirable example of the savage on the borderland of grace and culture. But now I only glanced at him, and then to where at his side a girl was crouching, a gem of human loveliness against that dusky setting. It was Heru, my ravished princess, and still clad in her diaphanous hither robes, her face white with anxiety, her eyes bright as stars, the embodiment of helpless flowery beauty. My heart turned over at the sight of her. Poor girl! When she saw me stride into the hall, she rose swiftly from Ar hap's side, clasped her pretty hands, and giving a cry of joy would have rushed towards me. But the king laid a mighty paw upon her, under which she subsided with a shiver as though the touch had blanched all the life within. "Good morning, your majesty," I said, walking boldly up to the lower step of the dais. "Good morning, most singular-looking vagrant from the unknown," answered the monarch. "In what way can I be of service to you?" "I have come about that girl," I said, nodding to where Heru lay blossoming in the hot gloom like some night-flowering bud. "I do not know whether your majesty is aware how she came here, but it is a highly discreditable incident in what is doubtless your otherwise blameless reign. Some rough scullions entrusted with the duty of collecting your majesty's customs asked Prince Hath of the Hither people to point out the most attractive young person at his wedding feast, and the prince indicated that lady there at your side. It was a dirty trick, and all the worse because it was inspired by malice, which is the meanest of all weaknesses. I had the pleasure of knocking down some of your majesty's representatives, but they stole the girl away while I slept, and briefly, I have come to fetch her back." The monarch had followed my speech, the longest ever made in my life, with fierce blinking eyes, and when it stopped, looked at poor shrinking Heru as though for explanation, then round the circle of his awestruck courtiers, and reading dismay at my boldness in their faces, burst into a guttural laugh. "I suppose you have the great and puissant Hither nation behind you in this request, Mr. Spirit?" "No, I came alone, hoping to find justice here, and if not, then prepared to do all I could to make your majesty curse the day your servants maltreated my friends." "Tall words, stranger. May I ask what you propose to do if Ar hap, in his own palace, amongst his people and soldiers, refuses to disgorge a pretty prize at the bidding of one shabby interloper, muddy and friendless?" "What should I do?" "Yes," said the king with a haughty frown. "What would you do?" I do not know what prompted the reply. For a moment I was completely at a loss to say to this very obvious question,
And then, all on a sudden, remembering they held me to be some kind of disembodied spirit, by a happy inspiration, fixing my eyes grimly on the king, I answered, "What would I do? Why, I would haunt you." It may not seem a great stroke of genius here, but the effect on the Martian was instantaneous. He sat straight up, his hands tightened, his eyes dilated, and then fidgeting uneasily, after a minute he beckoned to an overdressed individual, whom Heru afterwards told me was the court necromancer, and began whispering in his ear. After a minute's consultation he turned again, a rather frightened civility struggling with anger in his face, and said, "We have no wish, of course, stranger, to offend you or those who have had the honor of your patronage. Perhaps the princess here was a little roughly handled, and I confess, if she were altogether as reluctant as she seems, a lesser maid would have done as well. I could have wooed this one in Seth, where I may shortly come, and our espousals would probably have lent, in the eyes of your friends, quite a cheerful aspect to my arrival. But my ambassadors have had no great schooling in diplomacy. They have brought Princess Heru here, and how can I hand her over to one I know nothing of? How do I know you are a ghost after all? How do I know you have anything but a rusty sword and much impertinence to back your astonishing claim?" "Oh, let it be just as you like," I said, calmly shelling and eating a nut I had picked up. "Only if you do not give the maid back, why then—" and I stopped, as though the sequel were too painful to put into words. Again that superstitious monarch of a land thronged with malicious spirits called up his magician, and after they had consulted a moment, turned more cheerfully to me. "Look here, Mr. From Nowhere, if you really are a spirit, and have the power to hurt as you say, you will have the power also to go and come between the living and the dead, between the present and the past. Now I will set you an errand, and give you 5 minutes to do it in." "5 minutes!" I exclaimed in incautious alarm. "5 minutes," said the monarch savagely, "and if in that time the errand is not done, I shall hold you to be an impostor, an impudent thief from some scoundrel tribe of this world of mine, and will make of you an example which shall keep men's ears tingling for a century or two." Poor Heru dropped in a limp and lovely heap at that dire threat, while I am bound to say I felt somewhat uncomfortable, not unnaturally when all the circumstances are considered, but contented myself with remarking, with as much bravado as could be managed, "And now to the errand, Ar-hap. What can I do for your majesty?" The king consulted with the rogue at his elbow, and then nodding and chuckling in expectancy of his triumph addressed me. "Listen," he cried, smiting a huge hairy hand upon his knee. "Listen, and do or die. My magician tells me it is recorded in his books that once, some 5,000 years ago, when this land belonged to the Hither people, there lived here a king. It is a pity he died, for he seems to have been a jovial old fellow, but he did die, and according to their custom they floated him down the stream that flows to the regions of eternal ice, where doubtless he is at this present moment, caked up with 10 millions of his subjects. Now just go and find that sovereign for me, O you bold-tongued dweller in other worlds." "And if I go, how am I to know your ancient king, as you say, amongst 10 million others?" "That is easy enough," quoth Ar-hap lightly. "You have only to pass to and fro through the ice mountains, opening the mouths of the dead men and women you meet, and when you come to a middle-sized man with a fillet on his head and a jaw mended with gold, that will be whom you look for. Bring me that fillet here within 5 minutes, and the maid is yours." I started, and stared hard in amazement. Was this a dream? Was the royal savage in front of me playing with me? By what incredible chance had he hit upon the very errand I could answer to best, the very trophy I had brought away from the grim valley of ice and death, and had still in my shoulder bag? No, he was not playing. He was staring hard in turn, joying in my apparent confusion, and clearly thinking he had cornered me beyond hope of redemption. "Surely your mightiness is not daunted by so simple a task," scowled the sovereign, playing with the hilt of his huge hunting knife. "And all amongst your friends' kindred, too. On a hot day like this it ought to be a pleasant saunter for a spirit such as yourself." "Not daunted," I answered coldly, turning on my heels towards the door, only marvelling that your majesty's skull and your necromancers could not between them have devised a harder task. Out into the courtyard I went, with my heart beating finely in spite of my assumed indifference, got the bag from a peg in my sleeping room, and was back before the log throne ere 4 minutes were gone. "The old hither king's compliments to your majesty," I said, bowing, while a deathly hush fell on all the assembly. "And he says though your ancestors little liked to hear his voice while alive, he says he has no objection to giving you some jaw now he is dead." And I threw down on the floor the golden circlet of the frozen king. Ar hap's eyes almost started from his head as, with his courtiers, he glared in silent amazement at that shining thing, while the great drops of fear and perspiration trickled down his forehead. As for poor Heru, she rose like a spirit behind them, gazed at the jawbone of her mythical ancestor, and then suddenly realizing my errand was done and she apparently free, held out her hands, and with a tremulous cry would have come to me. But Ar hap was too quick for her. All the black savage blood swelled into his veins as he swept her away with one great arm, and then with his foot gave the luckless jaw a kick that sent it glittering and spinning through the far doorway out into the sunshine. "Sit down," he roared, "you brazen wench, who are so eager to leave a king's side for a nameless vagrant's care. And you, sir," turning to me, and fairly trembling with rage and dread, "I will not gainsay you have done the errand set you, but it might this once be chance that got you that cursed token, some one happy turn of luck. I will not yield my prize on one throw of the dice. Another task you must do. Once might be chance, but such chance comes not twice." "You swore to give me the maid this time." "And why should I keep my word to a half-proved spirit such as you?" "There are some particularly good reasons why you should," I said, striking an attitude which I had once seen a music-hall dramatist take when he was going to blast somebody's future, a stick with a star on top of it in his hand and 40 lines of blank verse in his mouth. The king writhed, and begged me with a sign to desist. "We have no wish to anger you. Do us this other task, and none will doubt that you are a potent spirit, and even I, Ar hap, will listen to you." "Well then," I answered sulkily, "what is it to be this time?" After a minute's consultation, and speaking slowly as though conscious of how much hung on his words, the king said, "Listen. My soothsayer tells me that somewhere there is a lost city in a forest, and a temple lost in the city, and a tomb lost in the temple. A city of ghosts and jinns given over to bad spirits, wherefore all human men shun it by day and night. And on the tomb is she who was once queen there, and by her lies a crown. Quick, on you whom all distances are nothing, and who see, by your finer essence, into all times and places. Away to that city. Jostle the memories of the unclean things that hide in its shadows. Ask which amongst them knows where dead Queen Yang still lies in dusty state. Get guides amongst your comrade ghost, find Queen Yang, and bring me here in 5 minutes the bloody circlet from her hair." Then, and then for the first time, I believed the planet was haunted indeed, and I myself unknowingly under some strange and watchful influence. Spirits, demons, oh what but some incomprehensible power, some unseen influence shaping my efforts to its ends, could have moved that hairy barbarian to play a second time into my hands like this, to choose from the endless records of his world the second of the 2 incidents I had touched in hasty travel through it. I was almost overcome for a minute, then pulling myself together, strode forward fiercely, and speaking so that all could hear me, cried, "Base king, who neither knows the capacities of a spirit, nor has learned as yet to dread its anger. See, your commission is executed in a thought, just as your punishment might be. Heru, come here." And when the girl, speechless with amazement, had risen and slipped over to me, I straightened her pretty hair from her forehead, and then, in a way which would make my fortune if I could repeat it at the conjurer's table, whipped poor Yang's gemmy crown from my pocket, flashed its baleful splendor in the eyes of the courtiers, and placed it in the tresses of the first royal lady who had worn it since its rightful owner died 100 years before. A heavy silence fell in the hall as I finished, and nothing was heard for a time save Heru sobbing on my breast, and a thirsty baby somewhere outside calling to its mother for the water that was not to be had. But presently on those sounds came the fall of anxious feet, and a messenger, entering the doorway, approached the throne, laid himself out flat twice, after which obeisance he proceeded to remind the king of the morning ceremonial on a distant hill, to pray away the comet, telling his majesty that all was ready and the procession anxiously awaiting him. Whereupon Ar hap, obviously very well content to change the subject, rose, and coming down from the dais, gave me his hand. He was a fine fellow, as I have said, strong and bold, and had not behaved badly for an autocrat, so that I gripped his mighty fist with great pleasure. "I cannot deny, stranger," he said, "that you have done all that has been asked of you, and the maid is fairly yours. Yet before you take away the prize I must have some assurance of what you yourself will do with her. Therefore, for the moment, until this horrible thing in the sky which threatens my people with destruction is gone, let it be truce between us. You to your lodgings, and the princess back, unharmed, amongst my women till we meet again." "But—" "No, no," said the king, waving his hand. "Be content with your advantage. And now to business more important than 10,000 silly wenches." And gathering up his robes over his splendid war gear, the Wood King stalked haughtily from the hall. Chapter 17. Of Gulliver of Mars. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Christopher. Gulliver of Mars by Edwin L. Arnold. Chapter 18. Hotter and hotter grew that stifling spell, more and more languid man and beast, drier and drier the parching earth. All the water gave out on the morning after I had bearded Ar-hap in his den, and our strength went with it. No earthly heat was ever like it, and it drank our vitality up from every pore. Water there was down below in the bitter, streaming gulf, but so noisome that we dared not even bathe there. Here there was none but the faintest trickle. All discipline was at an end, all desire save such as was born of thirst. Heru I saw as often as I wished as she lay gasping, with poor Si at her feet, in the woman's veranda, but the heat was so tremendous that I gazed at her with lackluster eyes, staggering to and fro amongst the courtyard shadows, without nerve to plot her rescue or strength to carry out anything my mind might have conceived. We prayed for rain and respite. Ar-hap had prayed with a wealth of picturesque ceremonial. We had all prayed and cursed by turns, but still the heavens would not relent, and the rain came not. At last the stifling heat and vapor reached an almost intolerable pitch. The earth reeked with unwholesome humours no common summer could draw from it. The air was sulphurous and heavy, while overhead the sky seemed a tawny dome, from edge to edge of angry clouds, parting now and then to let us see the red disk threatening us. Hour after hour slipped by until, when evening was upon us, the clouds drew together, and thunder, with a continuous low rumble, began to rock from sky to sky. Fitful showers of rain, odorous and heavy, but unsatisfying, fell, and birds and beasts of the woodlands came slinking into our streets and courtyards. Ever since the sky first darkened our own animals had become strangely familiar, and now here were these wild things of the woods slinking in for companionship, sag-headed and frightened. To me especially they came, until that last evening, as I staggered dying about the streets or sat staring into the remorseless sky from the steps of Heru's prison house, all sorts of beasts drew softly in and crowded about, whether I sat or moved, all asking for the hope I had not to give them. At another time this might have been embarrassing, then it seemed pure commonplace. It was a sight to see them slink in between the useless showers, which fell like hot tears upon us. Sleek panthers with lolling tongues, russet red wood dogs, bears and sloths from the dark arcades of the remote forest, all casting themselves down gasping in the palace shadows, strange deer who staggered to the garden plots and lay there heaving their lives out, mighty boars who came in from the river marshes and silently nozzled a place amongst their enemies to die in. Even the wolves came off the hills, and with bloodshot eyes and tongues that dripped foam, flung themselves down in my shadow. All along the tall stockades apes sat sad and listless, and on the roof ridges storks were dying. Over the branches of the trees, whose leaves were as thin as though we had had 6 months' drought, the toucans and Martian parrots hung limp and fashionless like gaudy rags, and in the courtyard ground the corn rats came up from their tunnels in the scorching earth to die, squeaking in scores along under the walls. Our common sorrow made us as sociable as though I were Noah and Ar-hap's palace mound another Ariout. Hour after hour I sat amongst all these lesser beasts in the hot darkness, waiting for the end. Every now and then the heavy clouds parted, changing the gloom to suddenly fiery daylight as the great red eye in the west looked upon us through the crevice, and, taking advantage of those gleams, I would reel across to where, under a spout leading from a dried rivulet, I had placed a cup to collect the slow and tepid drops that were all now coming down the reed for Heru. And as I went back each time with that sickly spoonful at the bottom of the vessel, all the dying beasts lifted their heads and watched, the thirsty wolves shambling after me, the boars half sat up and grunted plaintively. The panthers, too weak to rise, beat the dusty ground with their tails, and from the portico the blue storks, with trailing wings, croaked husky greeting. But slower and slower came the dripping water, more and more intolerable the heat. At last I could stand it no longer. What purpose did it serve to lay gasping like this, dying cruelly without a hope of rescue, when a shorter way was at my side? I had not drank for a day and a half. I was past active revelling. My head swam. My reason was clouded. No, I would not stand it any longer. Once more I would take Heru and poor Si the cup that was but a mockery after all, then fix my sword into the ground, and try what next the fates had in store for me. So once again the leathern mug was fetched and carried through the prostrate guards to where the Martian girl lay, like a withered flower upon her couch. Once again I moistened those fair lips, while my own tongue was black and swollen in my throat, then told Si, who had none all the afternoon, to drink half and leave half for Heru. Poor Si put her aching lips to the cup and tilted it a little, then passed it to her mistress. And Heru drank it all, and Si cried a few hot tears behind her hands, for she had taken none, and she knew it was her life. Again picking a way through the courtyard, scarce noticing how the beasts lifted their heads as I passed, I went instinctively, cup in hand, to the well, and then hesitated. Was I a coward to leave Heru so? Ought I not stay and see it out to the bitter end? Well, I would compound with fate. I would give the malicious gods one more chance. I would put the cup down again, and until 7 drops had fallen into it I would wait. That there might be no mistake about it, no sooner was the mug in place under the nozzle wherefrom the moisture beads collected and fell with infinite slowness, than my sword, on which I meant to throw myself, was bared and the hilt forced into a gaping crack in the ground, and sullenly contented to leave my fate so, I sat down beside it. I turned grimly to the spout and saw the first drop fall, then another, and another later on, but still no help came. There was a rift in the clouds now, and a glare like that from an open furnace door was upon me. I had noticed when I came to the spring how the comet which was killing us hung poised exactly upon the point of a distant hill. If he had passed his horrible meridian, if he was going from us, if he sunk but a hair's breadth before that 7th drop should fall, I could tell it would mean salvation. But the 4th drop fell, and he was as big as ever. The 5th drop fell, and a hot, pleasing nose was thrust into my hand, and looking down, I saw a grey wolf had dragged herself across the court, and was asking with eloquent eyes for help I could not give. The 6th drop gathered, and fell. Already the 7th was like a seedling pearl in its place. The dying wolf yanked affectionately at my hand, but I put her by, and undid my tunic. Big and bright that drop hung to the spout lip. Another minute, and it would fall. A beautiful drop. I laughed, peered closely at it, many-coloured, prismatic, flushing red and pink. A tiny living ruby, hanging by a touch to the green rim above. Enough, enough. The quiver of an eyelash would unhinge it now, and angry with the life I already felt was behind me, and turning in defiant expectation to the new to come, I rose, saw the red gleam of my sword jutting like a fiery spear from the cracking soil where I planted it, then looked once more at the drop, and glanced for the last time at the sullen red terror on the hill. Were my eyes dazed, my senses reeling? I said a space ago that the meteor stood exactly on the mountain top, and if it sunk a hair's breadth I should note it. And now, why there was a flaw in its lower margin, a flattening of the great red foot that before had been round and perfect. I turned my smarting eyes away a minute, saw the 7th drop fall with a melodious tingle into the cup, then back again. There was no mistake. The truant fire was a fraction less. It had sunk a fraction behind the hill even since I looked, and thereon all my life ran back into its channels. The world danced before me, and "Heru!" I shouted hoarsely, reeling back towards the palace. "Heru! 'Tis well! The worst is past!" But the little princess was unconscious, and at her feet was poor Si, quite dead, still reclining with her head in her hands just as I had left her. Then, my own senses gave out, and dropping down by them, I remembered no more. I must have lain there an hour or two, for when consciousness came again it was night, black, cool, profound night, with an inky sky low down upon the tree tops, and out of it such a glorious deluge of rain descending swiftly and silently as filled my veins even to listen to. Eagerly I shovelled away to the porch steps, down them into the swimming courtyard, and ankle deep in the glorious flood, set to work lapping furiously at the first puddle, drinking with gasps of pleasure, gasping and drinking again, feeling my body filling out like the thirsty steaming earth below me. Then, as I still drank insatiably, there came a gleam of lightning out of the gloom overhead, a brilliant yellow blaze, and by it I saw a few yards away a panther drinking at the same pool as myself, his gleaming eyes low down like mine upon the water, and by his side 2 apes, the black water running in at their gaping mouths, while out beyond were more pools, more drinking animals. Everything was drinking. I saw their outlined forms, the gleam shining on wet skins as though they were cut out in silver against the darkness, each beast steaming like a volcano as the heaven-sent rain smoked from its fevered hide, all drinking for their lives, heedless of aught else. And then came the thunder. It ran across the cloudy vault as though the very sky were being ripped apart, rolling in mighty echoes here and there before it died away. As it stopped, the rain also fell less heavily for a minute, and as I lay with my face low down, I heard the low, contented lapping of numberless tongues unceasing, insatiable. Then came the lightning again, lighting up everything as though it were daytime. The twin black apes were still drinking, but the panther across the puddle had had enough. I saw him lift his grateful head up to the flare, saw the limp red tongue licking the black nose, the green eyes shining like opals, the water dripping in threads of diamonds from the hairy tag under his chin and every tuft upon his chest, then darkness again. To and fro the green blaze rocked between the thunder crashes. It struck a house 100 yards away, stripping every shingle from the roof better than a master builder could in a week. It fell a minute after on a tall tree by the courtyard gate, and as the trunk burst into white splinters, I saw every leaf upon the feathery top turn light side up against a violent reflection in the sky beyond. And then the whole mess came down to earth with a thud that crushed the courtyard palings into nothing for 20 yards, and shook me even across the square. Another time I might have stopped to marvel or to watch, as I have often watched with sympathetic pleasure, the gods thus at play. But tonight there were other things on hand. When I had drunk, I packed up an earthen crock, filled it, and went to Heru. It was a rough drinking vessel for those dainty lips, and an indifferent draught, being as much mud as aught else, but its effect was wonderful. At the first touch of that turgid stuff, a shiver of delight passed through the drowsy lady. At the second she gave a sigh, and her hand tightened on my arm. I fetched another crockful, and by the flickering light rocking to and fro in the sky, took her head upon my shoulder, like a prodigal new come into riches, squandering the stuff, giving her to drink and bathing face and neck till presently, to my delight, the princess's eyes opened. Then she sat up, and taking the basin from me, drank as never lady drank before, and soon was almost herself again. I went back into the portico, there snuffing the deep, strong breath of the fragrant black earth, receiving back into its gaping self what the last few days had taken from it, while quick succeeding thoughts of escape and flight passed across my brain. All through the fiery time we had just had, the chance of escaping with the fair booty yonder had been present. Without her, flight would have been easy enough, but that was not worth considering for a moment. With her it was more difficult, yet, as I had watched the woodmen, accustomed to cool forest shades, faint under the fiery glare of the world above, to make a dash for liberty seemed each hour more easy. I had seen the men in the streets drop one by one, and the spears fall from the hands of guards about the palisades. I had seen messengers who came to and fro collapse before their errands were accomplished, and the forest women who were Heru's gaolers groan and drop across the thresholds of her prison, until at length the way was clear. A babe might have taken what he would from that half-scorched town and asked no man's leave. Yet what did it avail me? Heru was helpless, my own spirit burnt, in a nerveless frame, and so we stayed. But with rain strength came back to both of us. The guards, lying about like black logs, were only slowly recovering to consciousness. The town still slept, and darkness favoured. Before they missed us in the morning light, we might be far on the way back to Seth. A dangerous way truly, but we were like to tread a rougher one if we stayed. In fact, directly my strength returned with the cooler air, I made up my mind to the venture and went to Heru, who by this time was much recovered. To her I whispered my plot, and that gentle lady, as was only natural, trembled at its dangers. But I put it to her that no time could be better than the present. The storm was going over. Morning would line the black mantle of the night with a pink dawn of promise. Before anyone stirred we might be far off, shaping a course by our luck and the stars for her kindred, at whose names she sighed. If we stayed, I argued, and the king changed his mind, then death for me, and for Heru the arms of that surly monarch, and all the rest of her life caged in these palisades amongst the uncouth forms about us. The lady gave a frightened little shiver at the picture, but after a moment, laying her head upon my shoulder, answered, "Oh, my guardian spirit and helper in adversity, I too have thought of tomorrow, and doubt whether that horror, that great swine who has me, will not invent an excuse for keeping me. Therefore, though the forest roads are dreadful, and Seth very far away, I will come. I give myself into your hands. Do what you will with me." "Then the sooner the better, princess. How soon can you be prepared?" She smiled, and stooping picked up her slippers, saying as she did so, "I am ready." There were no arrangements to be made. Every instant was of value. So, to be brief, I threw a dark cloak over the damsel's shoulders, for indeed she was clad in little more than her loveliness and the gauziest filaments of a hither girl's underwear, and hand in hand led her down the log steps, over the splashing ankle-deep courtyard, and into the shadows of the gateway beyond. Down the slope we went, along towards the harbour, through a score of deserted lanes where nothing was to be heard but the roar of rain and the lapping of men and beasts, drinking in the shadows as though they would never stop, and so we came at last unmolested to the wharf. There I hid royal Seth between two piles of merchandise, and went to look for a boat suitable to our needs. There were plenty of small craft moored to rings along the quay, and selecting a canoe (it was no time to stand on niceties of propriety) easily managed by a single paddle, I brought it round to the steps, put in a fresh water pot, and went for the princess. With her safely stowed in the prow, a helpless, sodden little morsel of feminine loveliness, things began to appear more hopeful at an escape down to the blue water, my only idea, for the first time possible. Yet I must needs go and well nigh spoil everything by over-solicitude for my charge. Had we pushed off at once, there could be no doubt my credit as a spirit would have been established for all time in the thither capital, and the belief universally held that Heru had been wafted away by my enchantment to the regions of the unknown. The idea would have gradually grown into a tradition, receiving embellishments in succeeding generations, until little wood children at their mothers' knees came to listen in awe to the story of how, once upon a time, the sun god loved a beautiful maiden, and drove his fiery chariot across the black night fields to her prison door, scorching to death all who strove to gainsay him. How she flew into his arms, and drove away before all men's eyes in his red car into the west, and was never seen again. The foresaid sun god being I, Gullivar Jones, a much underpaid lieutenant in the glorious United States Navy, with a packet of overdue tailor's bills in my pocket, and nothing lovable about me save a partiality for meddling with other people's affairs. This is how it might have been, but I spoiled a pretty fairy story, and changed the whole course of Martian history by going back at that moment in search of a rap for my prize. Right on top of the steps was a man with a lantern, and half a glance showed me it was the harbour master met with on my first landing. "Good evening," he said suspiciously. "May I ask what you are doing on the quay at such an hour as this?" "Doing? Oh, nothing in particular. Just going out for a little fishing." "And your companion, the lady, is she too fond of fishing?" I swore between my teeth, but could not prevent the fellow walking to the quay edge and casting his light full upon the figure of the girl below. I hate people who interfere with other people's business. "Unless I am very much mistaken, your fishing friend is the Hither woman brought here a few days ago as tribute to Ar-hap." "Well," I answered, getting into a nice temper, for I had been very much harassed of late, "put it at that. What would you do if it were so?" "Call upon my rain-drunk guards, and give you in charge as a thief caught meddling with the king's property." "Thanks. But as my interview with Ar-hap have already begun to grow tedious, we will settle this little matter here between ourselves at once." And without more to do, I closed with him. There was a brief scuffle, and then I got in a blow upon his jaw which sent the harbour master flying back head over heels amongst the sugar bales and potatoes. Without waiting to see how he fared, I ran down the steps, jumped on board, loosened the rope, and pushed out into the river. But my heart was angry and sore, for I knew, as turned out to be the case, that our secret was one no more. In short time we should have the savage king in pursuit, and now there was nothing for it but a headlong flight with only a small chance of getting away to distant Seth. Luckily the harbour master lay insensible until he was found at dawn, so that we had a good start, and the moment the canoe passed from the arcade-like approach to the town, the current swung her head automatically seaward, and away we went downstream at a pace once more filling me with hope. End of Chapter 18. Recording by James Christopher. jxchristopher@yahoo.com. Of Gulliver of Mars. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Christopher. Gulliver of Mars by Edwin L. Arnold. Chapter 19. All went well, and we fled down the bitter stream of the Martian Gulf at a pace, leaving me little to do but guide our course just clear of snags and promontories on the port shore. Just before dawn, however, with a thin mist on the water, and flocks of a flamingo-like bird croaking as they flew southward overhead, we were nearly captured again. Drifting silently down on a rocky island, I was having a drink at the water picture at the moment, while Heru, her hair beaded with prismatic moisture, and looking more ethereal than ever, sat in the bows timorously inhaling the breath of freedom, when all on a sudden voices invisible in the mist came round a corner. It was one of Ar hap's war canoes toiling upstream. Heru and I ducked down into the haze like dab chicks and held our breath. Straight on towards us came the toiling ship, the dip of oars resonant in the hollow fog, and a ripple babbling on her cutwater plainly discernible. Oh ho, ho ho, how high, sounded the sleepy songs of the rowers till they were looming right abreast, and we could smell their damp hides in the morning air. Then they stopped suddenly, and someone asked, "Is there not something like a boat away on the right?" "It is nothing," said another, "but the lees of last night's beer curdling in your stupid brain." "But I saw it move." "That must have been in dreams." "What's all this talking about?" growled a sleepy voice of authority from the stern. "Bowman, sir, says he can see a boat." "And what does it matter if he can? Are we to delay every time that lazy ruffian spying a shadow makes it an excuse to stop, to yawn and scratch? Go on, you plankful of lubbers, or I'll give you something worth thinking about." And joyfully, oh so joyfully, we heard the sullen dip of oars commence again. Nothing more happened after that, till the sun at length shone on the little harbour town at the estuary mouth, making the mast of fishing craft clustering there like a golden reed bed against the cool, clean blue of the sea beyond. Right glad we were to see it, and keeping now in shadow of the banks, made all haste while light was faint and mist hung about to reach the town, finally pushing through the boats and gaining a safe hiding place without hostile notice before it was clear daylight. Covering Heru up, and knowing well all our chances of escape lay in expedition, I went at once, in pursuit of a plan made during the night, to the good dame at what, for lack of a better name, must still continue to be called the fish shop, and finding her alone, frankly told her the salient points of my story. When she learned I had robbed the lion of his prey, and taken his new wife single-handed from the dreaded Ar hap, her astonishment was unbounded. Nothing would do but she must look upon the princess, so back we went to the hiding place. And when Heru knew on this woman depended our lives, she stepped ashore, taking the rugged Martian hand in her dainty fingers, and begging her help so sweetly that my own heart was moved, and thrusting hands in pocket, I went aside, leaving those two to settle it in their own female way. And when I looked back in 5 minutes, royal Seth had her arms around the woman's neck, kissing the homely cheeks with more than imperial fervour, so I knew all was well thus far, and stopped expectorating at the little fishes in the water below, and went over to them. It was time. We had hardly spoken together a minute, when a couple of war canoes filled with men appeared round the nearest promontory, coming down the swift water with arrow-like rapidity. "Quick," said the fishwife, "or we are all lost. Into your canoe and paddle up this creek. It runs out to the sea behind the town, and at the bar is my man's fishing boat amongst many others. Lie hidden there till he comes if you value your lives." So in we got, and while that good Samaritan went back to her house, we cautiously paddled through a deserted backwater to where it presently turned through low sandbanks to the Gulf. There were the boats, and we hid the canoe and lay down amongst them till, soon after, a man easily recognized as the husband of our friend came sauntering down from the village. At first he was sullen, not unreasonably alarmed at the danger into which his good woman was running him, but when he set eyes on Heru he softened immediately. Probably that thick-bodied fellow had never seen so much female loveliness in so small a bulk in all his life, and being a man, he surrendered at discretion. "In with you, then," he growled, "since I must needs risk my neck for a pair of runaways who better deserve to be hung than I do. In with you both into this fishing cobble of mine, and I will cover you with nets while I go for a mast and sail, and mind you lie still as logs. The town is already full of soldiers looking for you, and it will be short shrift for us all if you are seen." Well aware of the fact, and now in the hands of destiny, the princess and I lay down as bidden in the prow, and the man covered us lightly over with one of those fine mesh seines used by these people to catch the little fish I had breakfasted on more than once. Materially I could have enjoyed the half hour which followed, since such rest after exertion was welcome, the sun warm, the lapping of sea on shingle infinitely soothing, and above all Heru was in my arms. How sweet and childlike she was! I could feel her little heart beating through her scanty clothing, while every now and then she turned her gazelle eyes to mine with a trust and admiration infinitely alluring. Yes, as far as that went, I could have lain there with that slip of maiden royalty forever, but the fascination of the moment was marred by the thought of our danger. What was to prevent these new friends giving us away? They knew we had no money to recompense them for the risk they were running. They were poor, and a splendid reward, wealth itself to them, would doubtless be theirs if they betrayed us even by a look. Yet somehow I trusted them as I have trusted the poor before with the happiest results, and telling myself this and comforting Heru, I listened and waited. Minute by minute went by. It seemed an age since the fishermen had gone, but presently the sound of voices interrupted the sea's murmur. Cautiously stealing a glance through a chink, imagine my feelings on perceiving half a dozen of Ar-hap's soldiers coming down the beach straight towards us. Then my heart was bitter within me, and I tasted a defeat, even with Heru in my arms. Luckily, even in that moment of agony I kept still, and another peep showed the men were now wandering about rather aimlessly. Perhaps, after all, they did not know of our nearness. Then they took to horseplay, as idle soldiers will even in Mars, pelting each other with bits of wood and dead fish, and thereon I breathed again. Nearer they came and nearer, my heart beating fast as they strolled amongst the boats until they were actually larking round the one next to ours. A minute or two of this, and another footstep crunched on the pebbles, a quick, nervous one, which my instinct told me was that of our returning friend. "Hello, old sprat catcher, going for a sail?" cried out a soldier, and I knew that the group were all round our boat, Heru trembling so violently in my breast that I thought she would make the vessel shake. "Yes," said the man gruffly. "Let's go with him," cried several voices. "Here, old dried haddock, will you take us if we help haul your nets for you?" "No, I won't. Your ugly faces would frighten all the fish out of the sea. And yours, you old chunk of dried mahogany, is meant to attract them, no doubt." "Let's tie him to a post and go fishing in his boat ourselves," someone suggested. Meanwhile 2 of them began rocking the cobble violently from side to side. This was awful, and every moment I expected the net and the sail which our friend had thrown down unceremoniously upon us would roll off. "Oh, stop that," said the Martian, who was no doubt quite as well aware of the danger as we were. "The tide's full. The shoals are in the bay. Stop your nonsense, and help me launch like good fellows." "Well, take 2 of us, then. We will sit on this heap of nets as quiet as mice, and stand you a drink when we get back." "No, not one of you," quoth the plucky fellow, "and here's my staff in my hand, and if you don't leave my gear alone I will crack some of your ugly heads." That's a pity, I thought to myself, for if they take to fighting it will be 6 to 1, long odds against our chances. There was indeed a scuffle, and then a yell of pain, as though a soldier had been hit across the knuckles, but in a minute the best disposed called out, "Oh, cease your fun, boys, and let the fellow get off if he wants to. You know the fleet will be down directly, and Ar-hap has promised something worth having to the man who can find that lost bit of crackling of his. It's my opinion she's in the town, and I for one would rather look for her than go haddock fishing any day." "Right you are, mates," said our friend with visible relief, "and what's more, if you help me launch this boat, and then go to my missus and tell her what you've done, she'll understand, and give you the biggest pumpkinful of beer in the place. Ah, she will understand, and bless your soft hearts and heads while you drink it. She's a cute one is my missus." "And aren't you afraid to leave her with us?" "Not I, my daisy. unless it were that sight of your pretty face might give her hysterics. Now lend a hand. Your accursed chatter has already cost me half an hour of the best fishing time." "In with you, old buck," shouted the soldiers. I felt the fisherman step in. As a matter of fact, he stepped in on my toes. A dozen hands were on the gunwales. 6 soldier yells resounded, it seemed, in my very ears. There was the grit and rush of pebbles under the keel, a sudden lurch up of the bows, which brought the fairy lady's honey-scented lips to mine, and then the gentle lapping of the deep blue waters underneath us. There is little more to be said of that voyage. We pulled until out of sight of the town, then hoisted sail, and, with a fair wind, held upon one tack until we made an island where there was a small colony of hither folk. Here our friend turned back. I gave him another gold button from my coat, and the princess a kiss upon either cheek, which he seemed to like even more than the button. It was small payment, but the best we had. Doubtless he got safely home, and I can but hope that Providence somehow or other paid him and his wife for a good deed bravely done. Those islanders in turn lent us another boat with a guide, who had business in the hither capital, and on the evening of the second day, the direct route being very short in comparison, we were under the crumbling marble walls of Seth. End of Chapter 19. Recording by James Christopher, jxchristopher@yahoo.com. Of Gulliver of Mars. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Christopher. Gulliver of Mars by Edwin L. Arnold. Chapter 20. It was like turning into a hothouse from a keen winter walk, our arrival at the beautiful but nerveless city after my life amongst the woodmen. As for the people, they were delighted to have their princess back, but with the delight of children, fawning about her, singing, clapping hands, yet asking no questions as to where she had been, showing no appreciation of our adventures, a serious offence in my eyes, and perhaps most important of all, no understanding of what I may call the political bearings of Heru's restoration, and how far their arch-enemies beyond the sea might be inclined to attempt her recovery. They were just delighted to have the princess back, and that was the end of it. Theirs was the joy of a vast nursery let loose. Flower processions were organized, garlands woven by the mile. A general order issued that the nation might stay up for an hour after bedtime, and in the vortex of that gentle rejoicing Heru was taken from me, and I saw her no more, till there happened the wildest scene of all you have shared with me so patiently. Overlooked, unthanked, I turned sulky, and when this mood, one I can never maintain for long, wore off, I threw myself into the dissipation about me with angry zeal. I am frankly ashamed of the confession, but I was a sailor ashore, and can only claim the indulgences proper to the situation. I laughed, danced, drank through the night. I drank deep of a dozen rosy ways to forgetfulness, till my mind was a great confusion, full of flitting pictures of loveliness, till life itself was an elusive pantomime, and my will but thistledown on the folly of the moment. I drank with those gentle roisterers all through their starlit night, and if we stopped when morning came, it was more from weariness than virtue. Then the yellow-robed slaves gave us the wine of recovery. Alas, my faithful An was not amongst them, and all through the day we lay about in sodden happiness. Towards nightfall I was myself again, not unfortunately with the headache well earned, but sufficiently remorseful to be in a vein to make good resolutions for the future. In this mood I mingled with a happy crowd, all purposeless and cheerful as usual, but before long began to feel the influence of one of these drifts, a universal turning in one direction, as seaweed turns when the tide changes, so characteristic of Martian society. It was dusk, a lovely soft velvet dusk, but not dark yet, and I said to a yellow-robed fairy at my side, "Whither away, comrade? It is not 8 bells yet. Surely we are not going to be put to bed as early as this?" "No," said the smiling individual, "it is the princess. We are going to listen to Princess Heru in the palace square. She reads the globe on the terrace again tonight, to see if omens are propitious for her marriage. She must marry, and you know the ceremony has been unavoidably postponed so far." Unavoidably postponed. Yes, heaven wotted I was aware of the fact. And was Heru going to marry Black Hath in such a hurry, and after all I had done for her? It was scarcely decent, and I tried to rouse myself to rage over it, but somehow the seductive Martian contentment with any fate was getting into my veins. I was not yet altogether sunk in their slothful acceptance of the inevitable, but there was not the slightest doubt the hot red blood in me was turning into vapid stuff, such as did duty for the article in their veins. I mustered up a half-hearted frown at this unwelcome intelligence, turning with it on my face towards the slave girl, but she had slipped away into the throng. So the frown evaporated, and shrugging my shoulders, I said to myself, what does it matter? There are 20 others will do as well for me. If not one, why then obviously another. 'Tis the only rational way to think. And at all events, there is the magic globe. That may tell us something. And slipping my arm round the waist of the first disengaged girl, we were not then, mind you, in Atlantic City, I kissed her dimpling cheek unreproached, and gaily followed in the drift of humanity, trending with a low hum of pleasure towards the great white terraces under the palace porch. How well I knew them! It was just such an evening Heru had consulted fate in the same place once before. How much had happened since then! But there was little time or inclination to think of those things now. The whole phantom city's population had drifted to one common center. The crumbling seaward ramparts were all deserted. No soldier watch was kept to note if angry woodmen came from overseas. A soft wind blew in from the brine, but told no tales. The streets were empty, and when as we waited far away in the southern sky, the earth planet presently got up. By its light Heru, herself again, came tripping down the steps to read her fate. They had placed another magic globe under a shroud on a tripod for her. It stood within the charmed circle upon the terrace, and I was close by, although the princess did not see me. Again that weird fantastic dance commenced, the princess working herself up from the drowsiest undulations to a hurricane of emotion. Then she stopped close by the orb, and seized the corner of the web covering it. We saw the globe begin to beam with veiled magnificence at her touch. Not an eye wavered. Not a thought wandered from her in all that silent multitude. It was a moment of the keenest suspense, and just when it was at its height, there came a strange sound of hurrying feet behind the outermost crowd, a murmur such as a great pack of wolves might make rushing through snow, while a soft long wail went up from the darkness. Whether Heru understood it or not I cannot say, but she hesitated a moment, then swept the cloth from the orb of her fate. And as its ghostly self-emitting light beamed up in the darkness with weird brilliancy, there by it, in golden furs and war panoply, huge, fierce, and lowering, stood Ar-hap himself. Aye, and behind him, towering over the crouching Martians, blocking every outlet and street, were scores and hundreds of his men. Never was surprise so utter, ambush more complete. Even I was transfixed with astonishment, staring with open-mouthed horror at the splendid figure of the barbarian king, as he stood a-glitter in the ruddy light, scowling defiance at the throng around him. So silently had he come on his errand of vengeance, it was difficult to believe he was a reality, and not some clever piece of stage play, some vision conjured up by Martian necromancy. But he was a good reality. In a minute, comedy turned to tragedy. Ar-hap gave a sign with his hand, whereon all his men set up a terrible war cry, the like of which Seth had not heard for very long, and as far as I could make out in the half-light, began hacking and hewing my luckless friends with all their might. Meanwhile the king made at Heru, feeling sure of her this time, and doubtless intending to make her taste his vengeance to the dregs. And seeing her handled like that, and hearing her plaintive cries, wrath took the place of stupid surprise in me. I was on my feet in a second, across the intervening space, and with all my force gave the king a blow upon the jaw which sent even him staggering backwards. Before I could close again, so swift was the sequence of events in those flying minutes, a wild mob of people, victims and executioners in one disordered throng, was between us. How the king fared I know not, nor stopped to ask, but half dragging, half carrying Heru through the shrieking mob, got her up the palace steps and in the great doors, which a couple of yellow-clad slaves, more frightened of the barbarians than thoughtful of the crowd without, promptly clapped to and shot the bolts. Thus we were safe for a moment, and putting the princess on a couch, I ran up a short flight of stairs and looked out the front window to see if there were a chance of succouring those in the palace square. But it was all hopeless chaos in the town, already beginning to burn, and not a show of fight anywhere which I could join. I glared out on that infernal tumult for a moment or two in an agony of impotent rage, then turned towards the harbour, and saw in the shrine of the burning town below the ancient battlements and towers of Seth beginning to gleam out, like a splendid frostwork of living metal clear cut against the smooth black night behind, and never a show of resistance there either. Ay, and by this time our Hap's men were battering in our gates with a big beam, and somehow, I do not know how it happened, the palace itself away on the right, where the dry as dust library lay, was also beginning to burn. It was hopeless outside, and nothing to be done but save Heru, so down I went, and, with the slaves, carried her away from the hall through a vestibule or two, and into an anteroom where some yellow-girt individuals were already engaged in the suggestive work of tying up palace plates in bundles. Amongst other things, alas, the great gold love bowl from which, oh so long ago, I had drawn Heru's marriage billet. These individuals told me in tremulous accents they had got a boat on a secret waterway behind the palace, whence flight to the main river, and so, far away inland, to another smaller but more peaceful city of their race, would be quite practical. And joyfully hearing this news, I handed over to them the princess, while I went to look for Hath. And the search was not long. Dashing into the banquet hall, still littered with the remains of a feast, and looking down its deserted vistas, there at the farther end on his throne, clad in the sombre garments he affected, chin on hand, sedate and royal melancholy, listening unmoved to the sack of his town outside, sat the prince himself. Strange, gloomy man, the great dead intelligence of his race shining in his face as weird and out of place as a lonely sea beacon fading to nothing before the glow of sunrise. Never had he appeared so mysterious as he was at that moment. Even in the heat of excitement I stared at him in amazement, wishing in hasty thought the confusion of the past few weeks had given me opportunity to penetrate the recesses of his mind, and therefrom retelling you things better worth listening to than all the incident of my adventures. But now there was no time to think, scarce time to act. "Hath!" I cried, rushing over to him. "Wake up, your majesty. The Thithermen are outside, killing and burning."
I know it.
"And the palace is on fire. You can smell the reek even here."
Yes.
"Then what are you going to do?"
Nothing.
"My word, that is a fine proposition for a prince. If you care nothing for town or palace, perhaps you will bestir yourself for Princess Heru." A faint glimmer of interest rose upon the alabaster calm of his face at that name, but it faded instantly, and he said quietly,
"The slaves will save her. She will live. I looked into the book of her fate yesterday. She will escape and forget, and sit at another marriage feast, and be a mother, and give the people yet one more prince to keep the faint glimmer of our ancestry alive. I am content."
"But damn it, man, I am not. I take a deal more interest in the young lady than you seem to, and have scoured half this precious planet of yours on her account, and will be hanged if I sit idly twiddling my thumbs while her pretty skin is in danger." But Hath was lost in contemplation of his shoestrings. "Come, sir," I said, shaking his majesty by the shoulder, "don't be down on your luck. There has been some rivalry between us, but never mind about that just now. The princess wants you. I am going to save both her and you. You must come with her."
"No."
"But you shall come."
"No."
By this time the palace was blazing like a bonfire, and the uproar outside was terrible. What was I to do? As I hesitated, the arras at the further end of the hall was swept aside. A disordered mob of slaves bearing bundles and dragging Heru with them, rushing down to the door near us. As Heru was carried swiftly by, she stretched her milk-white arms towards the prince, and turned her face, lovely as a convolvulus flower even in its pallor, upon him. It was a heart-moving appeal from a woman with the heart of a child, and Hath rose to his feet, while for a moment there shone a look of responsible manhood in his eyes. But it faded quickly. He bowed slowly, as though he had received an address of condolence on the condition of his empire, and the next moment the frightened slaves, stumbling under their burdens, had swept poor Heru through the doorway. I glanced savagely round at the curling smoke overhead, the red tendrils of fire climbing up a distant wall, and there on a table by us was a half-finished flask of the lovely tinted wine of forgetfulness. If Hath would not come sober, perhaps he might come drunk. "Here," I cried, "drink to tomorrow, your majesty. A sovereign toast in all ages, and better luck next time with these hairy gentlemen battering at your majesty's doors." And splashing out a goblet full of the stuff, I handed it to him. He took it and looked rather lovingly into the limpid pool, then deliberately poured it on the step in front of him, and throwing the cup away, said pleasantly,
"Not tonight, good comrade. Tonight I drink a deeper draught of oblivion than that. And here come my cupbearers."
Even while he spoke, the palace gates had given way. There was a horrible medley of shrieks and cries, a quick sound of running feet. Then again the arras lifted, and in poured a horde of Ar hap's men-at-arms. The moment they caught sight of us, about a dozen of them, armed with bows, drew the thick hide strings to their ears, and down the hall came a ravening flight of shafts. One went through my cap, two struck quivering in the throne, and one, winged with owl feather, caught Black Hath full in the bosom. He had stood out boldly at the first coming of that onset, arms crossed on breast, chin up, and looking more of a gentleman than I had ever seen him look before. And now, stricken, he smiled gravely. Then, without flinching, and still eyeing his enemies with gentle calm, his knees unlocked, his frame trembled. Then down he went headlong, his red blood running forth in rivulets amongst the wine of oblivion he had just poured out. There was no time for sentiment. I shrugged my shoulders, and turning on my heels, with the woodman close after me, sprang through the near doorway. Where was Heru? I flew down the corridor by which it seemed she had retreated, and then, hesitating a moment where it divided in two, took the left one. This, to my chagrin, presently began to trend upwards, whereas I knew Heru was making for the river down below. But it was impossible to go back, and whenever I stopped in those deserted passages, I could hear the wolf-like patter of men's feet upon my trail. On again into the stony labyrinths of the old palace, ever upwards, in spite of my desire to go down, until at last, the pursuers off the track for a moment, I came to a north window in the palace wall, and, hot and breathless, stayed to look out. All was peace here, the sky a lovely lavender, a promise of coming morning in it, and a gold-spangled curtain of stars out yonder on the horizon. Not a soul moved. Below appeared a sheer drop of 100 feet, into a moat winding through thickets of heavily scented convolvulus flowers to the waterways beyond. And as I looked, a skiff with half a dozen rowers came swiftly out of the darkness of the wall and passed like a shadow amongst the thickets. In the prow was all Hath's wedding plate, and in the stern, a faint vision of unconscious loveliness, lay Heru. Before I could lift a finger or call out, even if I had had a mind to, the shadow was gone round a bend, and a shout within the palace told me I was sighted again. On once more, hotly pursued, until the last corridor ended in two doors leading to a half-lit gallery with open windows at the further end. There was a wilderness of lumber down the sides of the great garret, and now I come to think of it more calmly, I imagine it was Hath's lost property office, the vast receptacle where his slaves deposited everything lazy Martians forgot or left about in their daily life. At that moment it only represented a last refuge, and into it I dashed, swung the doors to, and fastened them just as the foremost of Ar hap's men hurled themselves upon the barrier from outside. There I was like a rat in a trap, and like a rat I made up my mind to fight savagely to the end, without for a moment deceiving myself as to what that end must be. Even up there the horrible roar of destruction was plainly audible as the barbarians sacked and burned the ancient town, and I was glad from the bottom of my heart my poor little princess was safely out of it. Nor did I bear her or hers the least resentment for making off while there was yet time and leaving me to my fate. Anything else would have been contrary to Martian nature. Doubtless she would get away, as Hath had said, and elsewhere drop a few pearly tears, and then, over her sugar candy and lotus eating, forget with happy completeness, most blessed gift. And meanwhile the foresaid barbarians were battering on my doors, while over their heads choking smoke was pouring in ever-increasing volumes. In burst the first panel, then another, and I could see through the gaps a medley of tossing weapons and wild faces without. Short shrift for me if they came through, so in the obstinacy of desperation I set to work to pile old furniture and dry goods against the barricade. And as they yelled and hammered outside, I screamed back defiance from within, sweating, tugging and hauling with the strength of 10 men, piling up the old Martian lumber against the opening till, so fierce was the attack outside, little was left of the original doorway, and nothing between me and the besiegers but a rampart of broken woodwork, half seen in a smother of smoke and flames. Still they came on, thrusting spears and javelins through every crevice, and my strength began to go. I threw 2 tables into a gap, and brained a besieger with a sweetmeat seller's block, and smothered another, and overturned a great chest against my barricade. But what was the purpose of it all? They were 50 to 1, and my rampart quaked before them. The smoke was stifling, and the pains of dissolution in my heart. They burst in, and clambered up the ramparts like black ants. I looked round for still one more thing to hurl into the breach. My eyes lit on a roll of carpet. I seized it by one corner, meaning to drag it to the doorway, and it came undone at a touch. That strange, that incredible pattern! Where in all the vicissitudes of a checkered career had I seen such a one before? I stared at it in amazement, under the very spears of the woodmen, in the red glare of Hath's burning palace. Then, all on a sudden it burst upon me that it was the accursed rug, the very one which in response to a careless wish had swept me out of my own dear world, and forced me to take as wild a journey into space as ever fell to a man's lot since the universe was made. And in another second it occurred to me that if it had brought me hither, it might take me hence. It was but a chance, yet worth trying when all other chances were against me. As Ar Hap's men came shouting over the barricade, I threw myself down upon that incredible carpet, and cried from the bottom of my heart, I wish I were in New York. Yes. A moment of thrilling suspense, and then the corners lifted as though a strong breeze were playing upon them. Another moment, and they had curled over like an incoming surge. One swift glance I got at the smoke and flames, the glittering spears and angry faces, and then fold upon fold, a stifling, all-enveloping embrace, a lift, a sense of superhuman speed, and then forgetfulness. When I came to, as reporters say, I was aware the rug had ejected me on solid ground and disappeared forever. Where was I? It was cool, damp, and muddy. There were some iron railings close at hand, and a street lamp overhead. These things showed clearly to me, sitting on a doorstep under that light, head in hand, amazed and giddy. So amazed that when slowly the recognition came of the incredible fact, my wish was gratified and I was home again, the stupendous incident scarcely appealed to my tingling senses more than one of the many others I had lately undergone. Very slowly I rose to my feet, and as like a discreditable reveller as could be, climbed the steps. The front door was open, and entering the oh-so-familiar hall, a sound of voices in my sitting room on the right caught my ear. "Oh no, Mrs. Brown," said one, which I recognized at once as my Polly's. "He is dead for certain, and my heart is breaking. He would never, never have left me so long without writing if he had been alive." And then came a great sound of sobbing. "Bless your kind heart, miss," said the voice of my landlady in reply, "but you don't know as much about young gentlemen as I do. It is not likely, if he has gone off on a razzle-dazzle, as I am sure he has, he's going to write every post and tell you about it. Now off you go to your ma at the hotel like a dear, and forget all about him till he comes back. That's my advice." I cannot, Miss Brown. I cannot rest by day or sleep by night for thinking of him, for wondering why he went away so suddenly, and for hungering for news of him. Oh, I am miserable. Gully, Gully, come to me." And then there were sounds of troubled footsteps, pacing to and fro, and of a woman's grief. That was more than I could stand. I flung the door open, and dirty, dishevelled, with unsteady steps, advanced into the room. "Ahem," coughed Miss Brown. "Just as I expected." But I had no eyes for her. "Polly, Polly," I cried, and that dear girl, after a startled scream and a glance to make sure it was indeed the recovered prodigal, rushed over and threw all her weight of dear, warm, comfortable womanhood into my arms, and the moment after burst into a passion of happy tears down my collar. "Humph," quoth the landlady, "that is not what Brown gets when he forgets himself. No, not by any means." But she was a good old soul at heart, and seeing how matters stood, with a parting glance of scorn in my direction and a toss of her head, went out of the room and closed the door behind her. Need I tell in detail what followed? Polly behaved like an angel, and when, in answer to her gentle reproaches, I told her the outlines of my marvellous story, she almost believed me. Over there, on the writing desk, lay a whole row of the unopened letters she had showered upon me during my absence, and amongst them an official one. We went and opened it together, and it was an intimation of my promotion, a much better step than I had ever dared to hope for. Holding that missive in my hand, a thought suddenly occurred to me. "Polly dear, this letter makes me able to maintain you as you ought to be maintained, and there is still a fortnight of vacation for me. Polly, will you marry me tomorrow?" "No, certainly not, sir." "Then will you marry me on Monday?" "Do you truly, truly want me to?" "Truly, truly." "Then yes." And the dear girl again came blushing into my arms. While we were thus, the door opened, and in came her parents, who were staying at a neighbouring hotel, while inquiries were made as to my mysterious absence. Not unnaturally, my appearance went a long way to confirm suspicions such as Mrs. Brown had confessed to, and, after they had given me cold salutations, Polly's mother, fixing gold glasses on the bridge of her nose, and eyeing me haughtily therefrom, observed, "And now that you are safely at home again, Lieutenant Gullivar Jones, I think I will take my daughter away with me. Tomorrow her father will ascertain the true state of her feelings after this unpleasant experience, and subsequently he will no doubt communicate with you on the subject." This very icily, but I was too happy to be lightly put down. "My dear madam," I replied, "I am happy to be able to save her father that trouble. I have already communicated with this young lady as to the state of her feelings, and as an outcome I am delighted to be able to tell you we are to be married on Monday." "Oh yes, mother, it is true, and if you do not want to make me the most miserable of girls again, you will not be unkind to us." In brief, that sweet champion spoke so prettily and smoothed things so cleverly that I was forgiven, and later on in the evening allowed to escort Polly back to her hotel. "And oh," she said, in her charmingly enthusiastic way when we were saying good night, "you shall write a book about that extraordinary story you told me just now. Only you must promise me one thing." "What is it?" "To leave out all about Heru. I don't like that part at all." This with the prettiest little pout. "But, Polly dear, see how important she was to the narrative. I cannot quite do that." "Then will you say as little as you can about her?" "No more than the story compels me to." "And are you quite sure you like me the best, and will not go after her again?" "Quite sure." The compact was sealed in the most approved fashion, and here, indulgent reader, is the artless narrative that resulted, an incident so incredible in this prosaic latter day world that I dare not ask you to believe, and must humbly content myself with hoping that if I fail to convince, yet I may at least claim the consolation of having amused you. End of Chapter 20. End of Gulliver of Mars by Edwin L. Arnold. Recorded by James Christopher, jxchristopher@yahoo.com. May 2009.